Okay, I'd like to call this meeting to order. We have two council members walking through the door. Okay, I'll call the meeting to order. I'll say the procedures and then, well, first let's have the roll call.
Ms. Barnes?
Here.
Mr. Bowersox?
Here.
Ms. Shanawith?
Present.
Mr. Lewis?
Here.
Mr. Roberts?
Here.
Mr. Smythe?
Here.
Ms. Stevenson? Mayor Pressing?
Here. Okay, this is a special meeting of the Urbana City Council to hear an appeal by Mr. Howard Wakeland regarding the denial by the Historic Preservation Commission of a certificate of appropriateness and a certificate of economic hardship following a hearing held on April 2nd, 2008. The council will first vote on whether to affirm or overturn the Historic Preservation Commission decision regarding the certificate of appropriateness, and then a vote on the certificate of economic hardship will only be necessary if the council votes to affirm the decision to deny the certificate of appropriateness. Mr. Wakeland is represented by Mr. Glenn Stanko, and the Historic Preservation Commission by Ms. Alice Novak. The council must rely in making its decision only on the record from the Historic Preservation Commission held on April 2nd, 2008, and the arguments, statements presented by Mr. Stanko and Ms. Novak. Therefore, there will be no public input heard at this time. Ms. Rebecca Bird from our Community Development Division will make a brief presentation of the chronology of the Historic Preservation Commission processes and procedures that brought us to this point. After Ms. Bird, Mr. Stanko will be speaking first. Ms. Novak will then speak, and then Mr. Stanko may present a rebuttal. There will be strict time limits on each speaker. Both parties will receive no more than 30 minutes each, and Mr. Stanko will be allowed no more than 15 minutes in rebuttal. As each speaker concludes, council members may ask questions for clarification, but such questions should only be for clarification of evidence or testimony in the record, or the oral statements presented this evening. In asking questions, the council should avoid soliciting new evidence that was not considered by the Historic Preservation Commission. I'll call on Rebecca Bird to start.
This case is the appeal of the certificate of appropriateness to allow demolition of a house at 809 West Main Street, which is a non-contributing building in the West Main Street Historic District. I'll give a brief chronology of the facts in this case. On February 25th, 2008, Howard Wakeland, Wakeland Construction, submitted an application for a permit to demolish the rooming house at 809 West Main Street. Under the Historic Preservation Ordinance, such an application will act as a certificate of appropriateness application. On April 2nd, 2008, the Historic Preservation Commission held a public hearing. The Commission received 2 email messages against the application. A property owner of another house in the Historic District spoke in favor of the application. During the public hearing, Mr. Wakeland gave a presentation explaining his application. 6 members of the public, 2 of whom live in the Historic District, spoke against the application. The Commission then denied the application based on the following determinations. Number 1, the structure is original to the time period of the Historic District. Number 2, the structure maintains sufficient integrity. And number 3, the findings in the staff report, which listed a number of features of the existing house that help convey a sense of historical time and place, including scale and massing, setback and placement, the asbestos siding, the placement of window and door openings, the window sizes and shapes, the window and door trim, the historic building materials and techniques, and the placement of the front porch and its relationship to the building. With a unanimous vote, the Commission denied the application. On April 29th, Mr. Wakeland submitted a letter stating his intent to appeal the Historic Preservation Commission's decision regarding his application for a certificate of appropriateness. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Original to the time period of the historic district.
Thank you and good evening. I will make periodic reference to the Historic Preservation Ordinance during my argument here, and I think you should have a copy in front of you. So I would suggest that you might want to pull it out so we can look at some things together, because it's complicated and not the easiest thing in the world to follow. The record reflects, as Ms. Bird just pointed out, that the application seeking a permit to demolish was submitted by Mr. Wakeland on February 25th, 2008. And as she indicated, that application for the building permit serves as the application for a certificate of appropriateness. And as indicated, the public hearing was held and the decision was made by the Historic Preservation Commission on April 2nd, 2008. That is a period of 37 days. If you look at section, and I'm not going to repeat the Roman numeral 12 part of it. This is all in in Article 12 of the zoning ordinance. But if you look at section 6C3, 6.C.3, as I read it, the review process is supposed to take a total of 35 days from the time the application is submitted. There's a continuum where there's a preliminary review made to determine, a couple of preliminary reviews are made upon submission. The first is, if I can find it here. The first is whether or not the proposed activity requires a certificate of appropriateness. And then if it does, then it goes on. There's a review to determine whether or not it's a minor work, and if not, then it goes on to the Preservation Commission. And as I read that section and section 3 that follows, along with section 1, all of this is supposed to be done within 35 days. And if you look at the headings in table 12-2, they confirm that the Historic Preservation Commission review is supposed to be done within 35 days. My point is that because it did not hear this matter and act within the required 35 days, that the Historic Preservation Commission had no jurisdiction to consider the matter and deny Mr. Wakeland the demolition permit. And as a result, he should have been able to, he should have been issued the permit and been able to demolish the house. Now, sometimes time frames imposed upon governmental bodies are deemed directive or permissive as opposed to mandatory. And courts will say, well, no harm, no foul. In this case, it came within 2 days after the hearing and decision should have been made, which would have been on March 31st, 2008, if the time frame had been met. But that issue is addressed in the first part of the zoning ordinance, Article 2, Section Roman numeral 2-2E, says the word, quote, shall, unquote, is mandatory and not directory or permissive. So again, my point is the record clearly shows that there was a 37-day time lag. I don't believe the Historic Preservation Commission had any jurisdiction to act and to deny the demolition permit. My second point goes to the standards that the Historic Preservation Commission should apply or is supposed to apply. And if you look back at the definition of non-contributing properties, and everybody agrees that 809 West Main is a non-contributing property, the end of that definition says inclusion of these properties within a historic district subjects these properties to those design review standards and guidelines attributable to non-contributing properties. Okay, so what are the design review standards and guidelines applicable to non-contributing properties? We have Table 2, which tells us what the level of review is for non-contributing structures, but that doesn't really speak to the standards. If we go to subsection 6.c.4 and 5, both of those subsections speak in terms of review criteria in section 6.c. Well, I mean, there's no review criteria in section 6.c at all, let alone review criteria for non-contributing structures. I think that's probably a typo. I think what was intended is to go back to section 6.b, which does contain review criteria for certificate of appropriateness. That section does not specifically distinguish between non-contributing and contributing properties, so it's unclear whether that's supposed to be applied here, but I think that's the direction that the Historic Preservation Commission and staff went, is to look at section B here. Well, it was acknowledged in the staff report that the criteria laid out in subsection 2 and 3 did not apply because this was a demolition and those applied to remodeling or maintenance or alteration, but it did not apply to a demolition situation. So we have 2 and 3 basically knocked out because they're just not applicable to demolition. So I think what the Historic Preservation Commission looked at was number 1. And not specifically, as I read it, applicable to contributing or non-contributing, but apparently being applied to both here. And that says that the Preservation Commission shall consider, among other things, the effect of the proposed alteration, relocation, construction, removal, or demolition upon the exterior architectural features and upon the historic value, characteristics, and significance of the landmark or of the historic district. And as I read that, then each of those things, if they're considering the exterior architectural features, it is of the landmark or of the historic district, or if they're considering the historic value, characteristics, and significance, again, it is of the landmark or of the historic district. Well, this house is not a landmark, and there were really no findings made about the historic district, and it mentions nothing about the property in issue itself that's not a landmark, let alone a non-contributing property. So in the end, we really have no standards that apply to the demolition of a non-contributing structure in a historic district. And to the extent that there's been a finding that the structure can't be demolished, I think there's a significant due process problem here because there are just no standards. Well, we can go on a little bit here. even if you read subsection 1 to take out the part about, take out the wording of the landmark or of the historic district and just read it to say, you can consider the effect of the proposed alteration, relocation, construction, removal, or demolition upon the architectural features, stop there, and assuming that they're talking about upon the exterior architectural features of this non-contributing structure, we've got a further problem, because by designating this house non-contributing back when it passed the ordinance creating this district, this council has already found that it's a non-contributing property. And when you go back to the definition of non-contributing, that means that it has no historic, architectural, archaeological significance or integrity per se. So what happened here is that the Historic Preservation Commission basically made findings that would attribute historic value, historic features to a property that this council has already said has none. So it didn't follow the findings of the council. It went well beyond the findings of the council. And I don't think they can do that. So in the end, because this council made the earlier designation of non-contributing, there's really nothing that the Historic Preservation Commission can hang its hat on in terms of the intrinsic features of the house at 809 itself. So we're left with really nothing. And again, all of their findings were oriented towards what the commission believed were relevant architectural features or historical significance of the house itself. It's a big problem. Point number 3. There are already non-contributing new houses on either side of 809 West Main. I think when the ordinance was passed creating the district, one was already up at 811. There'd already been a demolition permit issued for 809. Subsequently, a house was constructed at 809. That house was up, I think the testimony reveals, at the time of this hearing. So both of those, all of the Wakeland properties, there were 3 in a row. There was the ugly apartment building on the corner, and then there was the house at 811, the new house at 811, then there was the rooming house at 809 that we're talking about here, and then there was the new house, or the vacant lot at that time, but the now new house at 807 and a half, that were all deemed to be non-contributing properties. So we have this rooming house right between 2 brand new properties that are themselves non-contributing. There's nothing in the record that would suggest that there was any harm or detriment to this historic district by putting in another new house and making it 3 in a row. In fact, I think you look at the pictures and most people would say that it would look much better if you did do that. There was also testimony about the type of house that Mr. Wakeland proposed to put up, and I think there was a house plans included in your packet, but the testimony indicated that he intended to put up a new structure with basically the same features as the old one had, only it would be a new structure, a front porch, gables, similar type windows. That's what he had plans for. But again, if you go back to the record, there's nothing in the record that suggests that in any way it would be harmful to this district to fill out that row of 3 new houses instead of leaving what I would only describe as an eyesore in between 2 brand new houses. So again, there are, although there's no standards, there's no real rationale for not allowing the demolition of this structure. I find this, and I've been involved in this from the moment that from the time the Historic Preservation Ordinance was proposed. I was not involved in the hearings before the Historic Preservation Commission on this application for certificate of appropriateness, but this is a difficult, if not impossible, ordinance to work with, and it's entirely vague and uncertain when it comes to how you handle non-contributing structures when the question is demolition, as it is here. And basically what the Historic Preservation Commission was forced to do is make it up as they go, and they did. And it doesn't fit in with the ordinance. It just simply does not work. So I think for all of those reasons, this council should vote to reject the decision of the Historic Preservation Commission and grant the certificate of appropriateness. And I'll be happy to answer any questions any of you might have.
Any questions? Charlie?
Yeah, Mr. Stanka, you refer to this house as an eyesore, yet Mr. Wakeland's owned this property for approximately 20 years, if I recall, right?
Right.
And in those 20 years, what maintenance has Mr. Wakeland done on the home to keep it from becoming an eyesore?
That puts me in a difficult position because that was not part of the evidence or testimony of the hearing.
I thought there was no summary of, there's all kinds, there are all these charts here. Is there a summary chart on how much was spent in historically?
All of that was in the second hearing about the certificate of
okay, so
economic
we have to
hardship.
do these separately then?
Right.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't think we should get to the second hearing, but if we do, that's where all of that information came up.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Alice Novak.
The Historic Preservation Commission heard public hearing, excuse me, HP-2008-COA-1 on April 2nd. At the early part of the meeting, we have time for written communications, and we had two which pertain to the case at hand. One was from Carolyn Baxley regarding statistics on the density of that particular block, 800 block. The other was from Sarah McAvoy, who spoke to two different hearings that we heard at that particular meeting. The one for this, she said, was concerning the proposed demolition of 809 West Main. Please know, and I quote, "Please know that the residents of Urbana, both my husband and myself, oppose the demolition." Under general audience participation, I informed the audience that they had 3 opportunities to speak and participate in the meeting. In addition to general audience participation that we have at the beginning of the meeting, we also had 2 public hearings that provided specific times to speak if people wanted to make more specific comments regarding the 2 hearings we had at that meeting. Excuse me. One person, Mr. Carl Long, spoke during general audience participation. Mr. Long lives at 105 North Kohler but owns a rental property in the 800 block, which is a non-contributing building. He commented in favor of granting the certificate of appropriateness for demolition, noting that the property appears, quote, beat down. It's run down. It looks, you know, I think it just looks tacky compared to the other finer homes on that block, end quote. He continued, quote, let him have his section of that south side where he's got 3 newer properties, his older apartment complex, end quote. The case then was opened later in the meeting, and the procedures were reviewed for the benefit of the audience and commissioners. Staff report was given by Rebecca Bird. The written report was dated 27 March 2008. The petitioner, according to the staff report, was requesting demolition for the following 8 reasons. The foundation had settled and caused uneven floor systems. The heat system was inefficient. The electrical system was outdated. The present bathrooms are inadequate. The front porch needs replacing. Windows and doors are not efficient. The driveway needs replacing, and there is no garage. The subject building was determined to be non-contributing by the City Council in the ordinance to designate the 800 block West Main Street Historic District. Section excuse me, Section 12-2 of the Historic Preservation Ordinance states, by definition of non-contributing buildings, a building, structure, site, or object which may be part of a landmark or district but does not possess historic, architectural, or archaeological significance or integrity per se. However, the relationship of these buildings, structures, sites, or objects to those that are contributing may be important in the preservation of the landmark or district. Inclusion of these properties within a historic district subjects these properties to those design review standards and guidelines applicable to non-contributing properties. The house at 809 West Main Street was built circa 1905. It's a 2-story vernacular I-house building type, which means it has 2 rooms wide and 1 room deep, and has a 2-story rear L, which is a common feature for this building type. The house has a distinctive tall, narrow profile and central hallway. It's clad in asbestos shingle siding, which, while it's not original, it has become a historic building material due to its importance as an early 20th century building material. The roof is side gabled with gabled dormer on the front facade, and the near full facade porch, common on I-houses, has a hipped roof supported by full-height Doric columns. The front porch is thought to be original, as is shown on the 1909 Sanborn map, which shows an accurate footprint of the building. Though the house has lacked maintenance over the years, it retains sufficient historic integrity to convey a sense of historical time and place for the district. This is conveyed through the following aspects: scale and massing, setback and placement, the asbestos shingle siding, placement of the door and window openings, window sizes and shapes, window and door trim, historic building materials and techniques, and placement of the front porch and its relationship to the building. The staff report also included statistics on historic buildings within the historic districts. There are 14 buildings in the 800 block of West Main Street, 13 houses and 1 apartment building. Of the 14 buildings, 71%, or 10, are at least 70 years old. If 809 West Main Street was to be demolished, that number is reduced to 64%. Additionally, on the south side of the block, there are 6 structures, including the house located at 809 West Main Street. Excuse me. 3 of the 6, or 50%, are at least 50 years old. Without the house at 809 West Main Street, only 2 of the buildings, 33%, would be 70 years old or older. Staff concluded in their report that the demolition of 809 West Main Street would have a negative impact on the historical value, characteristics, and significance of the 800 block of West Main Street Historic District. Following staff report, Mr. Wakeland, as owner and applicant, gave a number of comments. Mr. Wakeland said that the house, it's now a rooming house, and we more often than not had 5 people in it, but currently there's 4 people in it. If it were to be rebuilt, we would abide by the 4-person rule that Urbana has. Mr. Wakeland made the point of this being a non-contributing property. He commented on the appearance of the replacement building should demolition be allowed. Mr. Wakeland spoke about greenhouse, stating that a greenhouse is not green. It's a house in which you have better insulation. You have better control of the openings, and there's not cracks for wind to blow through, or you have better windows. You have better doors. Mr. Wakeland also commented on the conditions of the house. Somebody in the past went out and either got a tree trunk, I'm quoting from Mr. Wakeland, or large limbs from a tree, and those posts are under, several posts of that nature are under the building right now, end quote. Another quote, half of the basement floor is dirt. The foundation has caved in several places, and we've gone back and tried to repair it and keep going, but the foundation is not a good foundation, end quote. He also stated that the furnace was well over 40 years old. Quote, I've never been in the attic of the house, but because of other places that we've cut into and worked on, we believe that it's knob tube wiring in it, end quote. He added that the form of the wiring does not allow for grounded outlets, which is the 3-prong outlet Continued comments about the building's condition included the warped floor joists. Quote, "We can get by with less on remodeling if we want," end quote. Mr. Wakeland then continued to talk about the details of possible replacement building, including window and door openings, a possible dormer, and the setback. Mr. Wakeland concluded his comments, and then I reminded in general the commissioners and the audience that the Historic Preservation Commission was considering a certificate of appropriateness request for demolition of the existing building. We were not considering a replacement structure. We were only considering the request for demolition. Commissioners were given the opportunity to ask Mr. Wakeland questions. One commissioner, Commissioner Cahill, asked whether the house had been inspected by the city, and Mr. Wakeland replied no. As per our hearing order, I asked for audience participation from proponents, and there were none. I asked for audience participation from opponents, and there were 6, 2 of whom lived in the historic district in contributing buildings. The first opponent, and I have just brief excerpts, the first opponent was Carolyn Baxley of 510 West Main Street, 3 blocks from the historic district. Quote, "Staff did a particularly good job of preparing this case and pointing out the importance of even non-contributing properties to the district as a whole. The reasons that Mr. Wakeland has brought forward for demolishing the property seem to me to be in a litany of deferred maintenance. If you own a historic property or property of any age, you have to keep it up or things go down. I do feel, as staff does, that the relationship of this building to the others in the block are very important to the historic district," end quote. The second speaker, Brian Adams of 412 West Main Street, had been doing some research on the house and commented that he had found information that the house was actually there in 1904, which is only a 1-year difference of what the circuit date of 1905. He continued that he believed that the structure actually does show up on the 1869 bird's eye view map of Urbana, the point being that the house could possibly be considerably older than the 1905 date. The third speaker was Suzanne Bissonnette, 804 West Main Street, who lives across from the subject property. Quote, "And what I'm here to urge you to do is support the staff's recommendation not to demolish the property." So I have a couple of things to say about 809. First, it's a 100-year-old home. I want to share with you that with certainty that this house is in better shape than our house was at 804 when the restoration began on our house. Our house was actually condemned by the city, and yet they were able to bring it back. We were able to continue the process of restoration just like anybody would, regardless of whether they have a new home or an old home. Houses need maintenance. So that continues. Secondly, she said, "We've lived in the neighborhood for 16 years, and during that time it's been my observation that very little maintenance has been going on with the house across the street." Excuse me. "I think this house is integral to the neighborhood, and it has a certain aesthetic value to the historic district, even though it was determined that eventually not to be non-contributing," end quote. She added that she was stunned to hear Mr. Wakeland comment that he would demolish the house so that he could build a green house. She commented, and I quote, "I would suggest that demolishing a house and hauling that off to a landfill is not really a very good use of resources," end quote. Fourth, she referred to the problems that with the existing house that had been mentioned, such as sagging floors, and she said, "I can recommend," and a number of people in the neighborhood who have done so, have redone houses, certainly can recommend places. He can get some hydraulic lifts or energy-efficient furnaces to help remedy these problems. The fourth speaker was Phyllis Williams, who lives directly across the street from 809 at 810 West Main Street. Quote, "There's nothing that was in Mr. Wakeland's list that we haven't had to do on our own home. I mean, what's new? No rewiring, no replumbing, everything. I mean, that's just part of home ownership. Don't reward deferred maintenance," end quote. Fifth speaker was Linda Lorenz, who lives in an old house at 409 West Main Street, and noted that she had had her old home rewired and re-roofed. She agreed with previous comments and supported not demolishing the house. The sixth speaker was Alona Markovsky at 412 West Elm Street. And she said that the items that were listed for demolition, the settled foundation, inefficient heating system, outdated electrical system, inadequate bathrooms, front porch needing repair, replacement, inefficient windows and doors, and problems with the driveway, these are, I would say, pretty typical conditions of old houses, especially typical if the old houses are not regularly maintained. I don't think buildings become dangerous due to their age. They become dangerous if they become dangerous because they are not maintained," end quote. This concluded the audience participation and the Historic Preservation Commission discussion followed. A brief discussion of financial incentives was brought up as to whether the property might be eligible for federal incentives, which it is not because it's not listed on the National Register, or state incentives, which it's not because it's not partially owner-occupied. I believe Robert Myers noted that the property would qualify for the building permit fee waivers, even though it's a non-contributing building, that applies to contributing and non-contributing. Commissioner Zongrel brought up that whether the building is older, perhaps in the 1860s, or is more accurately the circa 1905 date, doesn't matter, that it still falls within the period of significance for the historic district and thus conveys a sense of time and place. He also noted that it did have good integrity. On the basis of those comments, Commissioner Zongrel made a motion to deny the demolition, and the motion was as follows: that the motion that we deny the certificate of appropriateness for reasons that the house is original to the time period of significance for the historic district, that the house continues to maintain good integrity, that the siding, though not original, has now developed historic character through age, and the staff comments that the house continues to convey a sense of historical time and place in the historic district for the following reasons: scale and massing, setback and placement, asbestos siding, placement of the window and door openings, window sizes and shapes, window and door trim, historic building materials and techniques, and the placement of the front porch and its relationship to the building. Ms. Stewart, during commentary following the motion, added that, quote, "I just want to underscore the observation by staff that if this building were to be demolished, the district would have 4 contiguous parcels on the south side of the block that disrupt the historic building fabric of the district, and that for me is extremely compelling," end quote. The motion carried then 6-0. We had 1 commissioner absent.
Any questions? Mr. Stanko, would you like to respond?
Well, I appreciate Ms. Novak's reading of parts of the staff report that were before the Historic Preservation Commission and parts of the transcript that I think you have copies of. Of course, a lot of people have opinions. That doesn't mean their opinions are based on fact. And those people who have houses in the neighborhood that they believe of historic value, I guess, can come in and say anything they want about their perceived observations of Mr. Wakeland's structure. The fact is that the Historic Preservation Commission did not deny the application based on any alleged deferred maintenance. That was not part of their findings. That was not part of the staff report. People made comments about it, but that was not the basis on which the Historic Preservation Commission acted. As a matter of fact, the whole argument about deferred maintenance is a bogus argument, because from the moment that Mr. Wakeland acquired that property some 20-plus years ago, he had every right to assume that he could tear it down and put something else up. And that did not change until this council passed the ordinance creating the Historic Preservation District in November of this past year. So if this was a situation where there had been a historic district in place for 20 years and Mr. Wakeland had intentionally let his house go downhill because he wanted to try to demolish it, knowing that he had to have it reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission, then maybe some of that's relevant. But if he buys that house with the idea that he wants to tear it down and put something new up, which he had every right to do until November of the past year, then there's no argument to make about the deferred maintenance. But again, it wasn't an issue. Ms. Novak points to comments in the staff report about percentages of structures in the historic district and the overall impact of the district. The Historic Preservation Commission did not predicate any of its findings on that. Its findings were predicated solely on looking at this structure and deciding that it had historic or architectural significance, when in fact this council has already said that it doesn't by designating it a non-contributing structure. So again, that was not the basis for the decision here. I didn't hear any response to the question of whether the Historic Preservation Commission had jurisdiction. I didn't hear any response to the fact that there are no standards that apply to demolition of non-contributing structures. What standards are we applying? I didn't hear any response to the argument that I just made here, and that you can't attribute historical value to a structure that's already been found to have no historic value. Again, you can go out and pull a litany of comments from interested citizens about what they think, but most of those comments were irrelevant to what took place in this hearing. So I don't even think it's a closed case. I mean, I don't think that there was any basis for denying Mr. Wakeland his demolition permit. I don't think the Historic Preservation Commission had jurisdiction to deny, because it didn't act within the required 35 days. And you know, I guess the final point I would make is it's not the Historic Preservation Commission's fault that this ordinance has a lot of holes in it and gaps. And I don't know for sure when it got passed or who was on the council when it got passed, but there's a lot of fixing up, pardon the terminology, that needs to be done to this ordinance. And we're being asked to operate in something which basically requires almost that the Historic Preservation Commission make the rules up as it goes along. And that's wrong. And that's not fair to a property owner, that's not fair to Mr. Wakeland, or it's not fair to any other property owner that comes in here and seeks to do something with an old, as in this case, decaying structure. Thank you for your time.
Are there any questions for Mr. Stanko or Alice Novak? Charlie?
Can we ask questions of our attorney to
Sure.
clarify certain points? Can you clarify the two issues that Mr. Stanko raises with respect to jurisdiction and the and what the procedures are for homes that are non-conforming in this district?
Jurisdictionally, I can, yes. Actually, I've been discussing that with Ms. Bird, and we've looked at the actual text. And she probably can tell you as well as I can what it says in that particular section. In the chart, it just says within 35 days. But if you look at the text, that would be like on page 165, the second paragraph of number 3. Within 35 days of receipt of the application for certificate of appropriateness or certificate of economic hardship, the Preservation Commission shall schedule a public hearing for consideration of the application. So, in my view, that was done. The application came in on February 25th, and it was scheduled for the next meeting was March 25th. Excuse me, March 5th. It was heard on April 2nd. It couldn't be heard by March 5th. But again, the ordinance doesn't require that it be heard, just that it be scheduled within 35 days.
Second point is how this ordinance handles non-contributing properties.
What is the specific, I mean, Mr. Stanko said a lot about that. What is the specific question?
I guess it's whether you can actually apply the criteria that the Historic Commission of scale and massing, the items that they give on page 3 of their, on the demolition application, which is that basically the Historic Preservation Commission found items A through G to be, to convey the sense of historical time and place in the district. You know, you got a non-conforming property, but the Historic Preservation Commission has found these particular aspects of this property to be contributing to the district as a whole. So I guess that's the aspect of it. You can either look at the house individually, or you can look at the district as a whole. And the way I'm viewing this, and maybe that's the way to phrase this, is the whole intent here is to view non-contributing properties as contributing to the district as a whole, and that's why the Preservation Commission can act and pass judgment as it did.
Can you give me 1 minute? I wanted to just confirm something by reading a paragraph. If you go to page 160, section 12(6)(a), it says a certificate of appropriateness is required for any alteration, relocation, construction, removal, or demolition that affects the exterior architectural appearance of any landmark or any building, structure, site, or object within a historic district, regardless of whether a building permit is required for such action. Contributing and non-contributing properties will be subject to the level of review found in Table 12.1 and Table 12.2. I read that just to suggest that this ordinance seems to me at least to anticipate reviewing non-contributing properties as well as contributing properties. And the plain language of this, at least this paragraph in section 12.6, indicates that a certificate of appropriateness would be required for any alteration of any landmark or any building within the historic district. So in those two instances, I think that militates towards the fact that the HBC does have to consider reviewing for a certificate of appropriateness, even when this council may have designated that building as non-contributing.
Thank you.
Mr. Roberts.
And my understanding is that the evaluation of these buildings for concerning their historic significance in the district, whether they're is based entirely upon the exterior appearance. Is that correct? The consideration is not about the internal structure, division of the rooms.
I don't have an opinion. That's not, strictly speaking, a legal issue. I don't, you know, I'd have to just read to you what is reflected in this ordinance, and I can do so if you would like. But it appears that they have a laundry list of criteria or things that will be reviewed: height, proportions.
And that's what I'm saying.
Yes.
That list, in my mind, has all to do with the shape, size, exterior placement of elements, construction materials, but it does not talk about the internal integrity, floor plan considerations, interior wall treatments, or even heating or cooling mechanisms.
Right.
It has to do with interior, with the exterior aspects of the building.
Right. Again, going back to 12.6A, it says that the certificate is required for any alteration, relocation, construction, removal, or demolition that affects the exterior architectural appearance of any landmark or any building structure, site, or object within a historic district.
I have one more thought about it. It may be somewhat oblique, but in the Historic Preservation Ordinance on page 154, under the criteria for historic districts, A, the significant number of buildings, structures, sites, or objects meeting any of the standards in section 12.5 C1. So there's a consideration of the number of buildings. In section B, an area containing a continuous grouping of properties, which having a sense of cohesiveness expressed through style. Therefore, that consideration for the historic district is contiguous groupings. And number C, an area of sufficient historical integrity to convey a sense of historic time and place. It also says that the Preservation Commission may find that portions of the nominated area or the nomination do not meet criteria of designation, and in which case such portions shall not be considered further. But if continuity is interrupted, areas may be considered as separate districts, which would indicate that if there were buildings that did not contribute to the district in some manner significantly, that they would not be included in a district, they would be separated from the district. But what I'm noticing is that this entire street has been included. It has in somehow been designated to be part of the district, whether it's specifically contributing or not, and that if the buildings were not valued for some aspect of their appropriateness to be in the district, they would not have been contained in the district. So, so the value of a non-contributing building that is in the district by intent still is important to the nature and the quality of the district. It must be, or else it would have been deleted from the district.
Well, I don't know if you're asking me a question. I want to avoid trying to advocate one viewpoint or another.
No,
I'm here to advise you about
I'm just reading the criteria for the historic districts, and I guess maybe I'm not asking a question, maybe I'm having discussion, so maybe that's not appropriate.
Any other questions? Okay, I guess we could vote then on whether to uphold. Would that be the form? Whether to uphold the historic preservation? To affirm. Okay.
I'm sorry, yes, the vote would be whether to affirm, if you want to affirm the HPC's decision to deny the certificate of appropriateness.
Charlie?
Okay, using the language on page 5 of the Certificate of Appropriateness memo of July 3rd, I move to affirm the Historic Preservation Commission's decision to deny the requested certificate denying permission to demolish the rooming house at 809 West Main Street.
I second that.
Okay, there's a motion by Smythe, seconded by Roberts. Any discussion? Ms. Stevenson?
Our attorney told me that because I wasn't here to hear Stanko's argument that I couldn't vote, but I would like to be noted as that I could vote. I will go back to November and what I said then, and I will say today. This is a property that is owned by Mr. Wakeland, and when I was 5 years old, my parents told me to mind my own business. And this is his business, this is his money, and I find it really hard to believe that a commission is telling him what to do with his property when it's not even a contributing property into a district. And I guess my other opinion in that is that if they like it so much, why don't they offer to buy it from him?
Anyone else? Lynn?
I'll be voting no with regard to affirming. And my rationale is, I think that Dennis said it in a piece of this. He used it in a different way. And this whole idea of lack of cohesiveness. If we have a great house, we have a new house, and then we have this old house. I mean, I would say putting this in the middle of those three houses makes sense to kind of cordon that off as an area, that is not in total contributing, to the historic district. So I'm really not seeing the significance of requiring either the owner to leave it alone, which he could do, and we end up with a house that looks very poor in the neighborhood, or having him remodel it at a cost that he feels is difficult for him to manage from a business perspective. So based on that, because it's in the middle of two homes that already don't fit, I think it makes sense to me to, if we're err on the side, in this case, of the owner, and allow him the freedom to build something I think that fits nicely, even though it's new.
Robert Lewis?
Well, as I think through the arguments placed before the council, it seems as if there are a number of, if I had to deal with it, and I applaud the Preservation Commission for its efforts to try and address some of the lack of continuity in this ordinance, and I think we need to address that as a council. And I think Lynn is absolutely correct. You need to err in favor of the petitioner in this case.
Would the clerk please call the roll?
Actually, I had.
Oh, it's my.
Well, I think Lynn raises issues that are more related to the second part of this, and I alluded to them earlier and changed my tact on questioning Mr. Stanko because of it. But since you've raised it, the issue here is does this place look bad because it's been neglected for 20 years? And basically you're saying, well, because it looks bad, let's replace it with a new piece of property.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Well, then you seem to be supporting, replacing this contiguous property with...
If I could clarify, though, what you said, I said.
Okay.
What my rationale is there's a lack of continuity with those three homes. And from a business perspective, for him to remodel it and incur that cost is not as cost effective for this owner as this option. So based on those reasons, I mean, if this house was in between two beautiful old homes, hey, I'd be hard pressed to agree with the petitioner. But it's not.
Yeah, well, the issue is that we've had this steady removal of these old properties because through demolition, through neglect. That's my point, and that at some point you've got to say no more. And we've had 20 years of neglect here, where if this property had been maintained, it would look perfectly fine, and replacing it with something in the style of that same piece of property. But not with the historical significance, not with the materials, it seems to me counter to the whole idea of maintaining a historic district, the district as a whole, which is how I'm viewing this.
Danielle?
Just want to state that I'll be supporting the motion for the following reasons, which is that this, by my look at the facts before us and the structure itself, that the structure is original to the time period of the historic district in which it stands, that the structure maintains good integrity, et cetera, that the following aspects of the house at 809 West Main Street help convey the sense of historical time and place in the historic district, scale and massing, setbacks and placement, the asbestos siding, placement of the window and door openings, window sizes and shapes, window and door trim, historic building materials and techniques, and the placement of the front porch and its relationship to the building. There's a reason that we included this property in the historic district, and I don't see that that reason has been overcome by the facts presented by the petitioner.
Would the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Barnes?
No.
Mr. Bowersox?
Yes.
Ms. Shenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis? Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
Ms. Stevenson?
I was told I have to abstain.
Okay, that motion carries. So then we need to go on to the second question.
Yes, that's correct. You need to.
And so we follow the same procedure of
Yes.
30 minutes?
Yes.
Mr. Stanko? Or does someone else want to, does the staff want to talk about the economic hardship first before we go?
I don't think we're going to have a staff presentation. I think since you voted to affirm the HPC's decision to deny the certificate of appropriateness, it now moves to the issue of whether or not Mr. Wakeland should be granted a certificate of economic hardship. Now, the parties can decide to rely on their previous argument, or Mr. Stanko, if you wanted to present something else regarding the economic hardship, this would be your opportunity to do so. And then Ms. Novak, if you want to, you can. You don't have to.
Well, I thought the plan was to have, if necessary, 2 separate hearings, and I assumed that there would be an introductory staff summary for this hearing as well.
Okay, then I stand corrected. That's fine. Then Ms. Byrd has some presentation that she would like to make.
I'll again just give a very brief recitation of the chronological facts in this case, which is HP 2008 EH01, the case for economic hardship. Following the denial of the application for a certificate of appropriateness, the petitioner submitted an application for a certificate of economic hardship on April 9th. On May 7th, the Historic Preservation Commission held a public hearing. Mr. Wakeland gave a presentation explaining his application. He also submitted a letter from Kevin Hunsinger, who is a residential developer, as expert testimony to support his application. Additionally, a local architect, Russ Dankert, and a local home inspector, Scott Spies, gave expert testimony supporting the application during the public hearing. 2 members of the public, one of whom lives in the historic district, spoke against the application. The commission voted 5-1 to deny the application based on the idea that the question of economic return should be amortized, retrospectively since the property was acquired by Mr. Wakeland. On May 9th, Mr. Wakeland submitted a letter stating his intent to appeal the Historic Preservation Commission's decision regarding his application for a certificate of economic hardship. And in this case, if I could draw your attention to the transcript of May 7th, there's a correction, a significant correction that you should be aware of. On page 73073, using the page numbers on the bottom right-hand side of each page. So this is the transcript of the May 7th meeting, and we're on page 073. In line 9, where it says commissioner, actually, if I could offer, that is not a commissioner, that was the planning manager, Robert Myers. And in line 12, again where it says commissioner, that also is Robert Myers. So that was not a commissioner, it was the planning manager. And then if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Brandon?
I guess I just wondered, Rebecca, whether there have been any other updates or information about the city staff analysis of this financial grid that was part of the original memo. Has anything changed in
No,
your
we haven't
picture and
done
your
further.
analysis?
We
Okay.
haven't done further analysis.
Okay, so that stands for the record. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Stanko?
Before I start addressing this case, because I didn't get a chance, I would like to interpose my objection to the instruction to Ms. Stevenson that she not vote in the last case. I think she was here for enough of the hearing to grasp what the arguments were, and while the fact that 4 council members voted to affirm, I object to the fact that she wasn't allowed to vote yea or nay.
That's fine. I'm shocked. I was actually doing that for Mr. Stanko's purposes because she only heard half of the presentation. She didn't arrive until after he had concluded his speaking. So this body can decide what it wants to do with that. I would just say as long as Mr. Stanko and Mr. Wakeland have waived any right to object to it later and want, the vote taken, it would be up to this body to determine whether or not that they want to do that. I don't think it's going to affect the vote. For the record, it's not going to change the outcome. So,
And
Yes, ma'am.
if we're going to reconsider that vote, I believe it has to be someone who voted on the affirming side. So I can't recommend that. It has to be someone who supported the vote.
Well, we'll move on to the second hearing then.
I would characterize the finding in this case, which is set forth on page 5 of Ms. Bird's memorandum of July 3rd, as strange, to say the least. And that finding was that the certificate of economic hardship should be denied because somehow the economic return from this property should be amortized retrospectively. That is language that's certainly not found in the ordinance. The correct standard is found in section 6D3, and that standard is that without approval of the proposed work, the property cannot obtain a reasonable economic return therefrom. And as I read that, that means as of this point in time, and does not leave room for some retroactive amortization of the return. This finding essentially ignored what I would say is the uncontradicted testimony in the record that the major problems with the house at 809 West Main are structural problems with the foundation and floor support, and that these problems go all the way back to the time the house was first constructed and had nothing to do with what Mr. Wakeland did or didn't do. In fact, he made some efforts to help shore up the floors, but other owners had also made some efforts. But most of the problems identified all go back to these basic structural flaws with the foundation and floor. And you can listen, you can read the testimony, you can look at the reports submitted, and all 4 of the professionals that offered opinions essentially said this. Even if someone could attribute the problems with the house to be Mr. Wakeland's fault because he hadn't maintained it since its acquisition, I again go back to what I said in the earlier hearing. Until this council passed the Historic Preservation Ordinance for the 800 block of West Main on November 5th, 2007, Mr. Wakeland had every right to choose not to maintain the structure with the intent to ultimately demolish it. And this is not a case where the historic district has been in place for a long time and he's affirmatively chosen not to maintain so that he can circumvent the provisions of the historic district. And Mr. Wakeland started to testify about the history relating to this house on page 58 of the transcript, and then he was cut off. And then the Historic Preservation Commission turned around and denied the application based on its perception, unsupported by any evidence, that the house had not been maintained subsequent to its acquisition by the Wakelands. If it was appropriate to consider the maintenance history of the house subsequent to its application, to its acquisition by the Wakelands, then the reasons why the property was acquired, the zoning at the time of the acquisition, subsequent developments related to the zoning, including a long-running legal challenge, were all relevant evidence. Counsel for the city and I have agreed that I can ask this council to take judicial notice of the appellate court case of Wakeland versus City of Urbana, which was decided by the 4th District Appellate Court in 2002. Just to give you a brief overview of the history of that case, it shows that the property in question here was acquired in October 1986 along with the two adjacent properties at 807 and 811. The opinion then recites that rundown houses ranging from 70 to 90 years old stood on 3 yacht lots, and the former owners had converted them into rental properties. The house at 809 West Main was a rooming house. Wakelands bought the 3 properties, or acquired the 3 properties, because they were zoned R4, medium density multiple family residential, and they intended to redevelop them with apartment buildings. They also invested in the properties because this city created an enterprise zone on July 1st, 1985, and sent letters, which the Wakelands received, encouraged them to invest in the enterprise zone. Within a couple of years, in November of 1988, the City Council created an interim development district that covered this property, those 3 properties, but prohibited development, multiple family development, except for reconstruction due to fire, explosion, etc., while the council did its downtown to campus study. 3 years later, 2.5 years later, almost maybe a little over 2 years later, January of 1991, as a result of that study, 203 properties were downzoned, including these 3 properties on Main Street. They were downzoned from R4 to R2, single-family residential. Council overrode a mayoral veto by Mayor Markland at the time. All right, at that point there are 2. They can still be demolished and someone can build single-family residences. But in March of '95, the Wakelands filed a petition to amend the zoning ordinance and to amend the comprehensive plan and to rezone those 3 lots, including the one at 809, from R2 to R4. Plan Commission voted to deny in May of '95. City Council voted to deny in July of 1995. We filed suit in October 1995 seeking a declaration that the R2 downzoning was unconstitutional, and also seeking a declaration restoring them to their original R4 classification. Case didn't get tried until October of 2001, or it didn't get decided until then. The local circuit court denied our complaint, affirmed on appeal by the 4th District Appellate Court in July 2002. Supreme Court denied leave to appeal in February of 2003. So basically from the time of acquisition, which that case showed to be in 1986, until 2003, these properties were in limbo, and Mr. Wakeland and his family had every right to believe they could demolish them and build apartment buildings, or if not do that, had every right to believe that they could demolish them and build single-family residences. So for at least, I count that as 14 years then, and then we come along the last year or so, and we deal with the Historic Preservation District, which was ultimately implemented, which again changed the rules of the game in midstream. So we went from R4 to R2 to not only is it R2, but you can't demolish unless the Historic Preservation Commission approves. The point being, again, if you're going to focus on lack of maintenance, you should only do it from the time the Historic Preservation Ordinance was passed, because there's nothing that says a property owner can't buy a piece of property with the expectation that he'll let it go and he'll tear it down and he'll replace it. That's exactly what they did. The evidence in this case that this place is really beyond repair is uncontradicted and overwhelming. We had Kevin Hunsinger. There was a written report from him. I think Mr. Hunsinger is viewed as a very reputable developer in this town. I know I've seen some pretty nice houses he's put up in the older parts of town. Russ Dankert, again, a reputable architect who served on the Champaign Plan Commission and is very much attuned to historic preservation. Scott Spies, again, a well-known and reputable home inspector. An appraiser, Jim Webster, who I'm sure everybody here knows, and Mr. Wakeland, who's an engineer. I guess that makes 5. I didn't count right. Mr. Wakeland, who is an engineer and former dean at the University of Illinois College of Engineering. In sum, here's what I think that the transcript shows that their testimony indicated. The house at 809 West Main is structurally unsound, especially the foundation, part of which was built on a dirt floor, and then another foundation was put over the old foundation. Many of the floor joists have failed and are generally in bad shape. They're much too far apart, distances that wouldn't pass muster today. The floors are far beyond level. There are holes in the brick chimney at the bottom and at the top. The porch needs to be demolished. In general, the house is in very poor physical condition, and the structure is unsafe. All the remodeling items proposed by Mr. Wakeland are essential. The cost of remodeling will exceed the cost of new construction. Russ Dankert said that he thought Howard's estimates were low for the remodeling costs. Demolition rather than remodeling is the only viable alternative. There are no significant design features worth saving. There is little or nothing worth saving in the house. The windows are not better or higher quality wood windows. There is nothing special about them. There is nothing unique about the window trim. The asbestos siding was essentially a cheap cover-up comparable to aluminum siding in the 60s and 70s and has no architectural significance. Asbestos is a hazardous material, and the wood behind the asbestos shingles probably has lead-based paint in it. The balloon, there's what's called balloon framing, which apparently allows fires to spread quickly. In fact, the testimonies indicated that the Wakelands have done work to the house over time, including putting in some support mechanisms to try to shore up the floor and the floor from the basement, redoing the upper and lower bathrooms twice, rewiring the house. Again, you can't visit the inadequate construction methods of many years ago on Mr. Wakeland, I don't believe. The staff, even according to the staff's own analysis in the staff report dated April 30th, 2008, there would be a negative net annual return if the structure had to be remodeled. And there would also be new construction would yield a positive return. They show a positive return for as is, but the fact is, the testimony is clear that this house can't stay the same as it is. Something has to be done. It has to either be demolished and rebuilt, or you somehow have to try to remodel it. And one of these people said that if you did that, you'd basically have a new house on an old frame is what you'd end up with. So, again, maintaining the status quo is not an option. It's clearly going to cost much more to try to remodel this house. When you engraft requirements for historic features, I'm sure that would cost even more. There is no practical option other than to demolish and reconstruct this house. And to the extent that the Historic Preservation Ordinance and the Historic Preservation Commission will not take the interior issues into account, in my opinion, that's a defect that has constitutional proportions here. I don't know how you can just look at the exterior features of the house and tell someone that they can't tear, someone that he or she can't tear it down when the inside of the house is a disaster, especially from a structural standpoint. And yet it's clear the Historic Preservation Commission didn't consider interior problems and didn't feel like they could consider interior problems. And Mr. Roberts alluded to a section earlier that I think they may have been looking at. So the flaw is in the ordinance, and the flaw is also in the ordinance as well as what the Historic Preservation Commission would not look at. If I could, going back to the report of Kevin Hunsinger. And again, this evidence was uncontradicted. He talked about the list of desirable and undesirable features that he looks for in a home and that makes a home unique. The only features, and he was talking about desirable features, the only features I found were the tall ceiling on the first floor, hardware floors on the first floor, and stained trim with rosettes in the living room. Unfortunately, this trim was limited to a living room addition and was inconsistent with the remainder of the house. The flooring was damaged due to structural settling and poor support. I inspected the entire building, making a list of repairs and replacements. I found the foundation in a failing state, structural design to be completely inadequate. All mechanical systems needed to be replaced or upgraded, insulation and windows replaced, interior plaster walls needed to be replaced due to structural shift. Exterior siding or replacement, front porch major repair or replacement.
5 minutes.
I've got about 12 by my clock, or 8, I'm sorry. To make this house into a safe, visually appealing, and functional home, it is going to be gutted down to the studs. It will have to be raised up and a new foundation constructed with additional support, new mechanical systems, insulation, siding, and windows. The cost estimates provided to me are realistic. They exceed the estimates of new construction, which is consistent with every project of this magnitude that I have personally undertaken. This building is in very poor condition and the house has no significant design features to save. Therefore, the result of a comprehensive remodeling project will not be a revitalized older home, but a modern-looking house built on 100-year-old framing. The cost of remodeling will exceed the cost of new construction. A new building will not look out of place because new construction surrounds this property. For these reasons, it is my opinion demolishing the existing building and construction of a new home is the appropriate strategy for revitalizing this property. You can go back to Russ Dankert, his testimony. However, based on this district and its non-contributing status for this particular building, it appears to me that you could possibly wind up with a better setting with a new building, and it would be safer. And I think he talked about the unsafe nature of this building, and Scott Spies talked about the unsafe nature of the building. Scott Spies, page 34, talks about some of the things he said. So I would have to say, as I went through it, I found little or nothing that I could actually say was in good shape. We need to save it. Let's build the house around it. Then he says on the next page, overall, while I was not intending to go in there and say, Howard, you're right, I'm afraid that there is very little that I can say. Basically, he's saying that he didn't intend to go in there and agree with Howard, but he came out of it saying that there's very little savable on the house. Goes on to talk about the poor foundation. So there's no testimony to contradict that. I'm not sure why the city council would want to make someone keep a house that the professionals have all determined to be unsafe, and it can't be made safe except at prohibitive cost. And that, look at the pictures again, where there's a property that would look a lot better if there were another new structure in between two existing new structures with features that resemble other historic structures in that neighborhood. Again, the standard was not followed. This retroactive amortization is making up the rules as they go. I've talked about that before. There's no basis for it. This house needs to be torn down. Something has to happen. It's clear that remodeling it will result in a negative return for the Wakelands. The only real option is to allow reconstruction, a new structure, and I would add, by the way, the Historic Preservation Commission gets to review what goes up, just as they reviewed the one that went up at 807.5 and approved it. So it's not like just anything is going to go in there. And you have, again, the proposed drawings in front of you. So I would ask you to overturn the decision of the Historic Preservation Commission on the Certificate of Economic Necessity. Thank you.
I have a question. Is the house occupied now?
It is. I believe it is.
Mr. Roberts?
The house was apparently purchased 20 years ago.
It was acquired. I kept seeing in this record that it was acquired 24 years ago. The appellate court case said it was acquired in '86. I believe it was acquired in a trade. I think that case reflects it. Mr. Wakeland traded another property for those 3 properties in there with the idea of putting up an apartment building complex.
So for how many years has the mortgage been paid? Or is it still, is Mr. Wakeland still paying a mortgage?
I'm not sure. Whatever's reflected in the application, I don't know if there was information about the mortgage or not.
Mm-hmm. So do you have a sense then of for how many years the mortgage has been retired?
I don't remember what's in the record about the mortgage, if there is anything in the record about the mortgage.
Okay. I'm just thinking about the overhead.
I just want to point out, it's being brought to my attention that that wasn't in the record originally.
Okay.
And that he's saying there is no mortgage. It was a trade for the property. So,
okay.
Well, I'm not saying there wasn't a mortgage on the houses. There may have been a trade and there may have been a mortgage.
Okay.
I just don't know.
But
the record doesn't reflect it.
But it's not part of the record, so we want to probably try to avoid getting into new evidence.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Stanko? Rebecca, you want to comment?
I just have a point of clarification. Mr. Stanko referred to the April 30th staff memo on page 5, the Table 2, City Staff Analysis of Table 1. That table, he referred to the first column, the cost of remodel, and said that city staff came to the conclusion that there would be a net annual income if he did remodel it. That first column is based entirely on information provided by Mr. Wakeland. That was not a city staff analysis piece. The city staff part of it is the third column on the right, the as-is column.
I'm sorry, I thought that was, I thought the city staff had gone through and reviewed and adjusted figures, but.
Any other questions for Mr. Stanko? Alice Novak, would you like to speak at this point?
Well, I won't. Oh, is that on? This time around, I will try to address specifically Mr. Stanko's comments among our general procedures. At issue this time around for the commission was whether a case had been shown that a reasonable return could not be made on the property. Maintenance was interwoven in virtually all the comments throughout the testimony and from both sides, from proponents and opponents to the issue. The focus most definitely was on the foundation issue and the shoring up of the floors, and a number of things that were cited in the building were related to what would seem to be a foundation and flooring issue. But other things that had been brought up included energy efficiency, insulation issues, the furnace, windows and doors. And so at some point in considering rehabilitation versus replacement, how much has to be done for an adequate rehabilitation of a building to still sufficiently shore up the historic building, the old building, and still have a reasonable return on the property. Ultimately, the commission's finding was that a case had not been made for that. Miscellaneous things, I would call your attention, I guess, to the page 61 and in the stamping at the bottom of the testimony. Mr. Stanko had mentioned specifically the history, I believe was the term, in the series of in the downzoning cases that resulted from the downtown to campus plan. The final determination of these was made July 26, 2002. At the appellate court level, so that there had been some time between now and that having occurred. Mr. Wakeland then on line 10 began to bring up the downzoning issue when he said 2 years later they downzoned us, and I checked the zoning before we went in there, and I did all the homework, and then I interrupted him to say, Mr. Wakeland, at this hour I particularly have to caution you to stick to the subject, please. I did not completely cut him off. And his level of comfort, I think, is illustrated by his following comment when he says on line 16, let me add just one other thing. And he continued to the point that he was wishing to make it at that time. Comments from Mr. Wakeland then included on page 059, looking at the numbers at the bottom, lines 9. We've put in new appliances, new refrigerators, new stove. We have and the things that the kids really the kids use, we've tried to keep them up to date, and the kids seem to be happy there. I don't understand it, but they do. The building has continued to be rented, and it's still occupied. So at what point do these conditions, I mean, the conditions have been like that for some period of time during the 20-plus years ownership in the Wakeland ownership. So at what point does this really become that severe? A number of people live with old windows and old doors and no insulation, and so how much is enough, or how much is too much in terms of the problems with the building? Were things that we considered as a commission. Sorry, I just have to check my notes for a second. In this case, I believe our public testimony did, in opponents to the awarding of the certificate of economic hardship, did include someone who had made an offer on the property for $25,000 more than the appraised value of the property. So I think another thing that has to be considered in reasonable returns is whether the property is marketable as well, and I think that was considered as well by the commission. But certainly maintenance and how much a lack of maintenance can cause later problems was an issue and was brought up repeatedly by a number of people. Regarding the asbestos shingle siding as a cheap cover-up, Now, we have a lot of vinyl siding, including on that street. Asbestos shingle siding probably dates to the 1930s, 1940s at the latest. Vinyl siding will never last that long. So there are various ways in looking at the materials issues and things that had been brought up as well. Balloon framing, if we knock down all of our balloon framing houses in Urbana, we're going to have a tax roll problem. If there's anything specifically I can address, I've highlighted other things, but I take it in the interest of time. I should not be repeating what you have in transcript.
Any questions for Alice Novak? Okay, thank you. Mr. Stanko, would you like to respond?
Well, it was pointed out at the hearing that this offer made by Ms. Baxley was just a letter that was not accompanied by any down money or earnest money. It seems kind of interesting that every time we have one of these issues regarding Main Street, why somebody like Ms. Baxley or Mr. Folk ostensibly make an offer. Mr. Wakeland's not required to give up the economic return that this property would generate in the future, and if he, if you said he had to take the offer, that's essentially what you would be saying. There's no real support for that. Actually, the final end of the legal cases wasn't until February 5th of 2003 when the Illinois Supreme Court denied leave to appeal. That was the end of the court cases. Even then, when Mr. Wakeland had R2 zoning, he had every reason to believe that if he wanted to tear the house down and build a new one, he could. And although you may quibble with it, any property owner has the right to do that, I guess short of having code violations that would make the place inhabitable. I think the testimony indicated that Mr. Wakeland had even invited the code inspectors to come in. I don't know if they have or not. And I don't know what you would do if they came in and found the place was unlivable. Then what are you going to do? Usually the municipality tries to make the owner either fix it or tear it down, and if you can't fix it, you tear it down. So what happens when you meet that intersection between a historic preservation district and a dump that needs to be torn down? The testimony is uncontradicted that the major problems that afflict this house and that generate many of the other problems were the way it was built back when it was built. It's the foundation, it's the floor joists. Somebody said that you couldn't go in and fix those and replace those because all the plaster would crack. So you would essentially have to redo everything. So yeah, Mr. Wakeland could go in there and do things piecemeal, but at some point the structure has to be addressed, and we're, as I said before, we're to the point of no return. I'd say look at the pictures. I don't know that anybody went over there and went through the house, although I believe there's something in the record that indicates they were offered the opportunity to do so. But the pictures are there, and you see what the foundation is like. You see what the basement floor joists are like. You see all the problems with this house that go back to its original structure. And finally, I'd make the statement that old doesn't make something historic. And, we seem to get we always get the statement that it conveys a sense of its time. Well, all right, everything conveys a sense of its time. That doesn't mean it's historic. Old age doesn't make something valuable. If everything that was old was historic, we'd never tear anything down and replace it. There's so much evidence in this record from 5 different experts in support of Mr. Wakeland, including himself, that I don't know how the commission found the way it did, and I don't know how this council can affirm the commission, because there's nothing offered to the contrary. So I'd ask you to give it careful consideration. I know everybody would like, we're not against historic preservation, but we're for historic preservation for the right structures. This just isn't a structure that should be or needs to be preserved. Thank you.
Charlie?
Yeah, Mr. Stanko, a number of people have looked at the house, including Mr. Wakeland. It's not my understanding Mr. Wakeland's an agricultural engineer, or is he a civil engineer with a PE, or I don't know what?
Agricultural engineer, master's degree with structures, structures emphasis.
Okay, so some structural background there, and Mr. Dankert probably as an architect has some structural background, but a structural engineer hasn't actually gone in and said one way or the other on this property, have they?
I don't know what Mr. Dankert's specialty is, but I would think that he was certainly qualified to render an opinion on that. I think probably any engineer could. I think the state of the record is that if somebody's going to say that it's structurally safe or it can be structurally recouped, then the burden is on the other side.
I think you need a PE to be able to certify a structure, Well,
if we're going to certify evidence, then...
Well, I mean, to certify that it's structurally sound or not would take a PE to do that. I'm not sure exactly what, but my point is that no officially designated structural engineer has looked at this property, right?
If Mr. Dankert is not a structural engineer, I would say that's true for purposes of this record.
Well, he's listed as an architect, so.
Oh, that's right. He is an architect. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Now, on page 7, I don't know if this is a question for staff or how this works. There's a staff recommendation says, there is no staff recommendation here. I don't know where this goes from here, but it says the last sentence is, this may require a continuation allow for additional assessment and review. Do we have something newer than this?
In the public hearing, the correction that I called your attention to earlier, where Mr. Myers spoke on page 73, that was the conclusion of the staff analysis, or additional staff analysis.
I'll need a moment to reread that then. Thank you.
Brendan.
73.
Okay. And on Charlie's question.
Go ahead. Would it be appropriate to have Robert repeat what he says here, or should we just have to read it out loud, or?
I think you can read it into the record if you want to. I mean, it's part of the record already, but I mean, if you want to read it orally.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Okay, yeah, well, to summarize page, I don't have page numbers like everybody else has. Page 73 is where he begins. He talks mostly about the foundation and how the foundation would definitely clearly needs to be replaced. But he questions whether stuff inside the house would need to be replaced and so on. To what extent that all of this work needs to be done, so I leave that, I guess, up to your own minds about to what extent and totality this building needs. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's, yeah, I'm on page 75. The bottom of page, yeah, it's just hard to read and talk. Okay, so on the bottom of page 75, in my mind, I found the testimony credible, but that it still leaves room for about to what extent that all of this work needs to be done. So I leave that, I guess, up to you in your own minds about to what extent and totality this building needs to be, essentially parts of the building need to be replaced. If it's not done all at once, it would need to be done over a period of years. He goes on to talk about replacing systems, mechanical, roofing, cooling, maybe not the walls like the plaster exterior wood siding. And then it switches to, so there really is no staff recommendation or conclusion. You're basically leaving it to us.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Okay, Brandon?
Yeah, I'm ready to make a motion to affirm the Historic Preservation Commission's decision to deny the requested certificate of economic hardship.
I'd like to ask a question of Ron, if I might, first.
I'll second that.
Question, Charlie?
Yeah. You know, in the staff recommendation from April 30th, and maybe it's superseded by this other testimony here, I guess I was working under the assumption that we might possibly have an opportunity for continuation and to get additional assessment. But I guess the underlying issue is that the structure, the foundation does need to be replaced, and there's a cost associated with that. I think is that the way I should interpret that, Rebecca? That there's no argument that the foundation needs to be replaced.
We didn't actually have someone that went in and looked at the structure, so we weren't prepared to be clear on that point.
But based on the testimony of the different individuals, in sum, the conclusion was to accept Mr. Wakeland's assessment that the foundation would need to be replaced. Is that a good way to summarize what you're saying, Robert?
Right. I think in terms of the evidence, the photos, et cetera, I just will clarify what you were asking. In terms of the evidence and the photos, it was very clear the foundation needed to be replaced. There's no question about that. In terms of the rest of my testimony at the end, the basic question in my mind was, and I'm just reflecting what's there, but is it credible that it would cost $208,000 to totally repair this building? And that would mean removing every single thing having to do with the building other than the exterior, other than the framing. Some elements perfectly clear that absolutely need to be replaced. Other things I think you'd have to, the commissioners would have to make up their own minds, such as the plaster walls and the exterior wood siding, which by themselves would be, if I recall correctly, about $60,000 of that $208,000.
Robert Lewis.
A couple things come to my mind as I listen to all the testimony given, and I want to be clear. We have looked at this older home, and we don't know all the extent of the plaster walls, whether they might include, I know from my experience that sometimes plaster walls of that age might have asbestos in it. So there's asbestos removal and a lot of other issues that might come into play once you start tearing into an older home of this size and, you know, and this age that's unknown. So the cost estimates, in my opinion, would be questionable at even at the level that they are now, based on my experience of dealing with, from a government point of view, of dealing with historical preservation. And it's unreasonable to assume that they might exceed the numbers given because of the nature of the age of the home. And I also, is it not true that the city in this particular application, has no financial assistance to the owner that he can get from the federal or state or whatever in this case. Is that true?
We do have a local incentive waiving building permit fees
But there are
for
no
local
state and
landmarks.
federal rates.
But I'm in terms of...
Not that would apply to
but
this
not-
house.
Right.
Not significant dollars.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Danielle?
I'm going to support the motion for the following reason, at least in part, which is the so-called economic hardship appears to be a condition created by the petitioner himself through significant deferred maintenance. If regular maintenance has been done, it appears remodeling would not exceed new construction. This is evidenced in page 5 of the April 30th memo when we look at the table. It appears that if the property was kept as is, and the fixes that need to be done, such as the foundation, were accomplished, it would still be the case that this property would have a positive cash flow, and therefore there is not an economic hardship at place, and I'll be voting yes.
Brandon?
Yeah, to speak in favor of the motion, the question before us tonight is from the ordinance, whether the property cannot obtain a reasonable economic return therefrom without approval of the proposed work, which in this case is the complete demolition. Based on the evidence, I feel that it hasn't been shown that the property cannot obtain a reasonable rate of economic return. There was lots of discussion that evening, for example, of doing some work like the foundation without complete demolition of the property, and lots of scenarios in between that could, as Danielle said, yield a positive rate of economic return. So because of the evidence, I don't believe we have enough evidence to say that the property cannot obtain the reasonable rate of economic return, and for that reason I'll be voting yes.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Dennis Roberts?
I'd just like to comment a little bit about the experience, what it would take to replace the foundation. I'm not an expert on this, but as it happens, a house on my street is having its foundation totally replaced beginning this month and through the next month. The house is being lifted up and rolled into the backyard. A new foundation is going to be built to match the footprint of the house, and the house is going to be rolled back in place. This house is a 3-story house with an addition on it and a front porch and a back porch, and it has original plaster in it. Now, it may be in better shape than Mr. Wakeland's house. I was somewhat amazed that people would attempt to do such a thing, but I have noticed that in this community, many homes have been taken off foundations and moved to many different locations for many years. And at this current time, we have a house barn, the Mumford Horse Barn, is in the process of being moved from its original location to a new location on St. Mary's Drive in the university area. And so in this community, this technology not only exists, but is used irregularly to make corrections to homes of old nature, where we find the need to repair becomes to such a degree that the house has to be moved or new foundations have to be created. And so it doesn't seem to be a new or a novel situation to address in this community. And so I don't see it as being, even though it does sound like a major concern and a major consideration to retain the building in its best condition, I don't see it being either unimaginable or unusual.
Anyone else? Okay, this is to affirm the Historic Preservations Commission denial of the economic interest, whatever it's called, hardship. Everyone votes, including Heather, right? She's heard the whole thing. So would the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Barnes?
No.
Mr. Bowersox? Ms. Shenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Smythe?
Yes.
Ms. Stevenson?
No.
I think that's a 4-3 vote, so the motion carries.